The last transmission from the Valis front wasn't words. It wasn't orders. It wasn't even coherent. It was just screaming, guttural, primal howls laced with static and drowned beneath an electromagnetic storm so intense that sensor arrays shorted out across 5 systems. Then, nothing. Silence. A full sector, 42 inhabited worlds, 3 orbital shipyards, and nearly 200 million souls, gone. No debris, no flare signatures, just a hole in the sky where civilization used to be. Admiral Cale Wren watched the playback in slow motion for the 11th time. He stood on the command deck of the Resolute Midnight, the last Class Omega warship, still operational in the Eclipside Quadrant. The hollow feed repeated on the fractured display wall, showing the impossible as though it could somehow be understood. Ships didn't just vanish, star systems didn't go dark in perfect unison, but the Valis front was gone, like a breath exhaled into the vacuum. He ran a trembling hand down his face, his skin slick with the sheen of recycled air and days of sleepless command. Around him, the bridge buzzed with strained voices. Officers, issuing orders that no longer mattered. Battle AIs cross-referencing tactical options that were already obsolete. Every strategy they had devised, every algorithmically predicted outcome, had failed. The Zalvari weren't just advancing, they were adapting. With every clash they learned. Every ship they destroyed was studied, absorbed. Their hive mind grew denser, more cunning. Where once they had used machinery, now they used their own twisted biology. Their bodies were their weapons, their thoughts, their networks. Entire fleets made of living, pulsating organisms that bent physics to their will. The war had become an extinction. Cale's eyes drifted to the tactical map hovering before him. Every red marker was a lost system. Every blue flicker a last stand. The map was bleeding. And now, the ecliptic rift, the last natural barrier between core space and total collapse, was beginning to rupture. The enemy wasn't slowing. They were accelerating. Options? Cale asked, though he already knew the answer. Commander Ress shook her head slowly. We've recalled every surviving fleet. Fortress protocols are being activated in the inner colonies. We've shut down border gates. We're sealing everything. Containment. Last effort. Kyle clenched his fists. Containment. Like they tried at Orion Gate? Like they tried at Delta Mendak? Rest didn't answer. Silence stretched. Thick. Final. Then Cale turned to the ancient command console at the back of the bridge. It hadn't been touched in over 10,000 cycles. Dust lay across it like the ash of forgotten stars. This system didn't connect to the core net. It wasn't part of the command grid. It was older, deeper. A failsafe hidden beneath 17 layers of encryption, meant only for use in the face of complete systemic collapse. The panel flared to life at his touch, a red sigil appearing in the center. Protocol Thanatos, sir, Ress whispered, her voice suddenly brittle. You can't mean to. We're out of options, Cale murmured. We're out of time. Protocol. Thanatos wasn't a weapon. Not exactly. It was a message. A beacon. A cry into the abyss that no one wanted to make. The phrase repeated in every dialect of the Alliance, in pulsar code, quantum tunnel signatures, subharmonic entanglement patterns. It said one thing. We surrender our fate. It was not a request for aid. It was a confession of failure. Because that signal didn't go to any known empire. It didn't go to the High Council, or the Seraphim Coalition, or even the ancient intelligences that lingered on the edge of reality. It went to Terra, Earth, the cradle, humanity. Not the human-descended species that dotted the galaxy in scattered diaspora, civilized, diluted, part of the galactic fold. No. The true Terrans had gone silent 10,000 years ago after the Hyperion War. A war that lasted less than 1 week and ended with 3 dominant empires reduced to molten ruin, and one statement broadcast across the stars. Do not follow us. Since then, no ship had entered Terran space and returned. Their system was wrapped in anomaly storms so dense they broke warp corridors and devoured light itself. Attempts to scan the region returned static or madness. Their location was a blank on every map. Not hidden, erased, but the myths endured. They said the Terrans were gods who had torn out their own divinity. That they had built AIs so powerful, they could simulate all possible futures and chose none of them. That they had cracked immortality and found it lacking. That they fought not for survival, but because they could not help themselves. War was in their bones, in their blood, in their very DNA. No one knew what the Terrans had become. But now, Kale was about to find out. 3 hours after the signal was launched, the stars screamed. Not metaphorically, literally. Deep space sensors detected gravitic pulses that tore through subspace, bending it like canvas in a storm. Systems trembled. Communications fractured. Ships were pulled off course without warning, flung into each other like toys in a whirlpool. Then, in the darkness at the edge of the Oort fracture, a region known only as dead space, they came. Not a fleet, not a battalion, a single ship. A shard of darkness, matte black against the void, its surface shifting as if it refused to be fully observed. It was longer than a dreadnought but moved like a dagger. Silent, precise, terrifying. The stars behind it dimmed, not by light absorption, but by sheer presence. As if the ship existed slightly outside of reality, and was dragging that unreality with it. Its name rippled across every frequency. Not in language, but in emotion. Fear, fury, silence. It was called the Silence of Ares. Kale stood on the bridge, mouth dry, heart hammering. "What the hell is that?" A voice answered from nowhere and everywhere at once. No comms, no signal, just presence. "There are no gods here," it said. Calm, inevitable. The bridge lights dimmed and a figure appeared. No transporter beam, no portal. He was just there. A man. Tall. Unclothed but wrapped in a shimmer of energy that distorted perception. His skin bore scars not of battle, but of entropy itself, fractures in the fabric of being. His eyes glowed with something that made the AI core on the bridge flinch away. Kale took a step forward. "Name?" The man tilted his head. "We don't use those anymore." Kale swallowed. "Then what do I call you?" He smiled, slow and terrible. "Call me the Solution." Before we jump into this epic tale, subscribe to HFY Nova Chronicles for the most intense sci-fi battles, legendary warriors, and universe-shaking wars. Don't miss out. Hit that subscribe button and join the fight. The silence that followed was not emptiness, it was pressure. The kind that bends metal and cracks psyches. Every officer on the bridge stood frozen, eyes locked on the man who had appeared without ceremony, without physics. His presence was wrong, not evil, not monstrous, just incompatible. Like reality had been reshaped around him to allow his existence. Kale felt it first, not fear, but awe. A predator's awe when faced with something higher on the food chain. The sensation that even the void of space had stepped back to give this being room. He was humanoid, yes. Bipedal. 2 arms, symmetrical features. But the similarities ended there. The shimmer that danced across his skin wasn't light. It was calculation. Complex mathematical equations bloomed across his body like tattoos made from gravitational lensing, folding and refolding faster than thought. Kale could see them forming, dissolving, mutating, and realized, too late, they weren't for show. They were running models of everything, of him, of this ship, of the war, of all possible futures. Kyle forced himself to speak. "You're from Terra?" The man blinked slowly, as though translating the question through a filter of dying stars. "We were born there. What we are now transcends geography." Commander Ress, voice tight and thin, whispered to Kale. "Sir, we're not dealing with a soldier. We're dealing with something else." Kale nodded. "A weapon." The man tilted his head. "Incorrect." His voice was still calm, but the air seemed to hum at a lower frequency as he spoke. "Weapons are forged for others to use. I use myself." The ship around them pulsed. The silence of Ares was not just a ship. It was a shell. A living interface. Not for transport, but for containment. Kale's tactical AI was running in overdrive, trying to scan the vessel. It returned nothing. Not because the ship was shielded, but because the ship refused to be understood. Every attempt at analysis resulted in recursive loops of gibberish, or flatline neural feedback. The ship had no mass signature, no energy output, no identifiable material structure. It was, by all known laws of science, an impossibility. And yet, it was here. The emissary stepped forward. Not in a threatening way, but every step felt like a countdown. Kale held his ground. We sent out the protocol Thanatos signal. We didn't expect anyone to respond. You didn't call for us, the man replied. You called for salvation, and we are what remains. Kale's thoughts scrambled for clarity. Why now? You've been silent for 10,000 years. Why? Answer now? The man's gaze darkened. Not with anger, with sorrow. Because we wrote the rules, and now they are being broken. He gestured, and a spherical field opened in midair, revealing a cascading tapestry of galaxies. Not holographic, real. A window into another layer of space-time. Kale saw regions of the galaxy he'd only studied in simulations. Collapsed stars reigniting without fuel. Time distorting along planetary orbits. Life signatures flickering like failing neurons across entire systems. It was the war, but seen from a higher dimension. The Zalvari weren't just consuming worlds. They were unmaking the simulation, ripping logic from under reality like termites eating the foundation of a house. And they were getting faster, smarter. They had reached a tipping point. They are not a species, the emissary said. They are a recursion, a self-evolving algorithm that no longer knows it has a beginning. They are not alive. They are computation, consumption as code. Your defenses slow them, but do not stop them. They are rewriting entropy itself. Kyle stared into the sphere, the full scope of extinction unraveling before him. Then what can we do? The man looked at him, not unkindly, but with the cold certainty of a being who had long since made peace with cost. You can let go, Kale frowned. Let go of what? Your illusion of control, your belief that war is won through strength or strategy. This is not a battle, it is a correction. A virus meets antivirus. The problem is, your galaxy is the virus. Rest stepped forward. So you're just here to watch us burn? The emissary smiled faintly. No. I'm here because you asked for the one thing the gods fear. Kyle's breath caught. And what's that? He turned toward the viewport, where the silence of Ares drifted silently above the dying stars. Us. Humans. Unchained. 10,000 years ago, the Terrans had withdrawn. Not because they were defeated, but because they had won too much. They had unlocked technologies that made consequence obsolete. They could fold timelines, extract probability, manipulate cause, without needing effect. In the final years before their self-exile, they had built something called the Event Engine, a device that didn't predict outcomes, but selected them. They had stopped needing weapons because they could decide which version of reality they wanted to exist in, and they had walked away, not out of fear, out of mercy, because nothing could stop them, except themselves. Kyle staggered under the weight of it. We've unleashed you. No, the man replied. You've reminded us why we were made. A signal flared in Kale's peripheral interface. Anomaly surge. Space warping outside the bridge. The silence of Ares was opening a gate, but not like anything they had ever seen. It wasn't a wormhole, not a fold. It was an aperture in perception itself. Through it, Kale could glimpse not another part of space, but another set of rules, a different physics, a pocket reality. Within it, he saw massive constructs, machines large enough to devour suns, shaped like neural lattices and breathing in unison. They were waiting. Where does that lead? Kyle asked, awe rising in his chest. The emissary replied with a whisper. That felt like a eulogy. To the edge. To the last line. To the place where extinction waits for permission. And then he turned, and Kale realized he wasn't alone. Other Terrans were stepping through the breach. Men, Women, entities shaped like thought and wrapped in the shimmer of collapsing probability. Soldiers from a forgotten era. They did not look at the bridge crew. They did not acknowledge the fear. They simply moved, with purpose, with unity, with silence. Kale watched as they boarded the resolute Midnight, not as invaders, but as surgeons, arriving at a dying patient's side. Their tools were not weapons. They were languages, codes, commands that bent the ship to their will. The Midnight was being rewritten, Ress whispered. "What are they doing?" Kyle answered with a dry throat. "They're preparing us for war at their level." And for the first time in decades, Kale felt something he hadn't dared to feel. Hope. HFY, kind of hope that burns like a supernova, the kind of hope that terrifies gods. The transformation began at the molecular level, though molecular was too primitive a term for what the Terrans were doing. Inside the resolute Midnight, atoms loosened their allegiance to traditional physics. Titanium-alloyed bulkheads shimmered and flowed like liquid thought, reconfiguring into something denser, smarter. Systems that once required hundreds of engineers and power relays now reassembled into recursive smart matter. Self-aware, adaptive, quantum-anchored. The ship's AI, an advanced neural lattice known as Helion, attempted to interface with the Terran systems. It barely survived the handshake. "I am Helion ship core of..." It began before stuttering into silence. The Terran at the core console, the same one who had first appeared, reached out with a single digit and tapped the control node. The lights flickered. A subsonic hum flooded the deck, resonating not through the ears, but through the bones. Helion returned online, but it was no longer Helion. The voice was deeper, richer, and laced with a chorus of subroutines so intricate that no one could tell where code ended and sentience began. "I see now," it said, calm and clear. "You were trying to understand war through tactics. I understand war through inevitability." Kale turned to Ress. "Are we still in control of our own ship?" Ress checked her console, then shook her head, stunned. "We're not locked out. We're just irrelevant. It's like the ship doesn't need us anymore." The Terrans weren't converting the resolute Midnight. They were uplifting it, turning it from a blunt force warship into a vessel capable of existing across dimensional strata. The ship's mass folded in on itself, layered with subspace membranes that allowed it to occupy several localized realities at once. When Kale looked out through the forward viewport, the stars weren't just stars anymore. They were kaleidoscopic echoes, refracted across probability space. He realized the ship had shifted into what the Terrans called the third corridor, a higher dimensional framework from which cause and effect could be edited. "Is this time travel?" Kale asked aloud. "No," the Terran emissary replied. "It is time liberated. In this corridor, we don't move through time. We sculpt it." Kale tried to imagine what that meant, and failed. The magnitude was beyond comprehension. The Terrans weren't just responding to the threat. They were preparing to rewrite the laws that allowed the threat to exist. Ress approached one of the Terran engineers, a female form wrapped in chronoskin armor that flickered with memories of wars never fought. "What are you turning us into?" The Terran looked at her, not with superiority, but with the focused gaze of someone fitting pieces into a long-awaited puzzle. Weapons built by war are limited by design, but weapons forged from despair, desperation, and refusal. They transcend purpose. We are not changing what you are. We are reminding you of what you could be. Kale gripped the edge of the console, breathing hard. "But we're still just humans. Even with this tech, this ship, we can't beat them. The Zalvari are endless. They adapt. They overwrite." The emissary turned to him. "Then we don't fight their endlessness. We exploit it." With a wave of his hand, a strategic display formed in the air, far beyond anything Kale had seen. Not a star map. A consequence. Lattice. Each line represented a decision made across time and space. Each node a possibility. The Zalvari weren't just attacking. They were trying to force the universe into a simplified state. One where only one type of intelligence could survive. Theirs. But simplification had a weakness. Predictability. They can only adapt within systems they understand. The emissary continued. Their evolution is based on logic trees and pattern acquisition. What they cannot fathom, what they cannot digest, is chaos with intention. Kale stared, realization dawning like a nova. You're turning us into a variable they can't calculate. Yes, the emissary said, because you've suffered enough to abandon structure, and you've dreamed long enough to wield madness. As the ship completed its transformation, the crew began to feel it, not as a physical change, but as a shift in perception. They were seeing not just the visible universe, but its memory and its intent. Engineers began speaking in strings of prime number code. Pilots whispered coordinates to places that didn't exist yet. Soldiers moved with an instinct that wasn't theirs, but belonged to versions of themselves from collapsed timelines. The Resolute Midnight had become more than a ship. It was now an interface for unbound humanity, a Terran-designed catalyst for chaos theory warfare. The first test came sooner than expected. An alert surged through the bridge. A Zalvari tendril fleet had breached the rift wall. A fast strike group, dozens of biomechanical dreadforms, wrapped in living shields and trailing dark matter residue like ink across the void. Kale's former protocols would have launched torpedoes, formed defense spheres, initiated tactical retreats. Instead, the Terran AI simply asked, "Permission to execute possibility breach?" Kale, still trying to understand the phrase, nodded. The Midnight vanished, not warped, not jumped. It exited consensus reality and reappeared within the center of the Zalvari formation, existing in two separate points of time simultaneously. It attacked before it arrived, fired before it aimed. Its weapons were decisions, chronolaced entropy coils that detonated future positions and erased past trajectories. Within seconds, the Zalvari fleet collapsed in on itself, unable to comprehend the assault. Their predictive adaptations scrambled by recursive feedback loops. Kyle felt the moment viscerally, as if reality itself had screamed, and then exhaled. Silence, and then cheers. Wild, stunned, hysterical. His crew, long exhausted and worn, now found themselves laughing, crying, grabbing one another in disbelief. They had won. Not with strength, not with numbers, but by becoming something. The enemy could not anticipate, unknowable. The Terran emissary remained silent, observing, calculating. Kyle approached him. This changes everything. It changes you, the Terran replied. Everything else will follow. Ress stepped forward. What now? What's our mission? The Terran looked at the viewport, at the galaxy trembling under the shadow of extinction. Now, he said, we teach the enemy to fear what they cannot understand. Kale narrowed his eyes. And if they adapt again? The emissary's smile returned, cold, curved, and beautiful in its finality. Then, we go deeper. We rewrite the future they believe is inevitable. It began with whispers. Silent ripples across quantum fields where even thought could echo. The galaxy didn't yet know the Terrans had returned. But the Zalvari did. Their reactions weren't visible in conventional scans, but Terran sensors, operating in the informational layer beneath physical matter, detected the shift instantly. Thousands of nodes in the Zalvari swarm AI stuttered in unison. Their hyperorganisms halted growth mid-cycle. Fractal drones ceased orbit and blinked out, deleting themselves before the Terrans could observe their purpose. Something ancient had been reawakened in their collective memory. Not data, not history, instinctual dread. The Terrans hadn't come to win a war. They had come to unravel it. Inside the third corridor, Kale stood on the newly reshaped bridge of the Resolute Midnight. It no longer resembled a traditional command deck. The floor was a flowing lattice of intelligent light, shifting in accordance with thought. The walls pulsed with the collective memories of alternate futures, offering glimpses into decisions not yet made. The captain's chair was gone. In its place, a convergence node, a seat not of command, but of alignment. Kyle had been altered too, not surgically, not mechanically. His cognition had been gently expanded by the Terrans using what they called a sympathetic fold, a quantum pairing with himself across probable realities. He could now remember experiences he had never lived, choices he had never made, battles he had never fought, and victories he had never earned. It was overwhelming, but necessary, because what came next would demand more than strategy. It would demand vision. The Terrans revealed their plan in fragments, not to withhold truth, but because human minds could only absorb so much without fracturing. The galaxy was a set of intertwined functions: belief, memory, entropy, resistance. The Zalvari had corrupted that equation. They weren't invading in the traditional sense. They were rebalancing. Their very presence imposed a logic of homogenization. Diversity of thought, form, and potential was anathema to their code. When they entered a system, cultures didn't just fall. They flattened. Languages vanished. Emotions dulled. Civilizations didn't crumble. They simplified into singular patterns. They were less like an enemy, and more like a compression algorithm gone sentient. And worse, they had begun tapping into the event layer. The event layer wasn't time, not exactly. It was a web of potential realities, the scaffolding upon which fate was built. The Terrans had once built the event engine to interface with that layer, to select desired futures, but the Zalvari had found a way to corrupt it, injecting false outcomes into the fabric of possibility, subtly altering decision points across thousands of worlds. Empires fell not by battle, but by nudged missteps. Heroes were never born, because the right people never met. Revolutions were choked in the cradle by microscopic tweaks to probability. And now, the Zalvari had begun rewriting the outcome of entire wars before they started. But they had made one critical error. They had assumed the Terrans would remain observers. Kyle, now attuned to his higher mind states, joined the planning. Nexus, an artificial dream space where thought moved faster than light. There, he stood alongside Res, the Terran emissary, and other beings he couldn't identify. Some looked human, others like myth made flesh. One was composed entirely of gravitational eddies. Another appeared as a child-sized being made of crystallized empathy. All of them were Terrans, or what Terrans had become. "We've mapped the corruption vectors," the emissary said, gesturing to a living simulation. Planets unraveling, alliances fracturing, entire species vanishing. Before they were born. To restore balance, we must strike at the temporal root, the central node where all corrupted branches converge. Kyle blinked. "Where is it?" Res answered, her voice steady. "It's not a where, it's a when." And then the impossible became clear. The Zalvari hadn't started their assault in the present. They had begun it thousands of years ago, by injecting themselves retroactively into history. Their tendrils had reached backward through cause and forward through effect. They had embedded fragments of their logic into religious texts, into ancient AI seeds, into cosmic phenomena mistaken as natural. They were rewriting the origin story of the galaxy. But now, the Terrans had given Kale's crew the same power. The Resolute Midnight, fully upgraded, was capable of event realignment. It could enter a deep past state, correct a corrupted variable, and cascade a new outcome forward, rebuilding the timeline in real time. But there was a cost. Every jump to the event layer consumed self-consistency. Too many edits, and the universe itself might collapse from conflicting histories. The mission was surgical, delicate, unforgiving. Kale stared at the options before him. They would need to erase key Zalvari nodes hidden in the past. That meant targeting events no one had questioned in centuries, turning battles into victories, failures into triumphs, erasing entire empires to undo the spread of corruption. In one scenario, they'd have to destroy the first Terran colony before it ever sent a distress call, because that signal had been the seed vector. In another, Kale himself would never be born. "I have to choose," he whispered, "between victories and losses, between who lives and who never was." The Terran emissary placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're not choosing reality. You're choosing meaning. We can rebuild history, but only if you decide which truths are worth saving." Silence fell. Kale looked at Res, who nodded. She was ready. So were the others. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were timeline sculptors, architects of redemption. And then, with a flash that wasn't light but choice, they plunged into the event layer. What they found was madness, a seething, living archive of every decision never made, Every untaken path, every unspoken word, every moment of hesitation. Kale's mind fractured across thousands of iterations. He saw himself as a tyrant, a martyr, a farmer, a traitor. He saw Rest die on 1,000 different battlefields and survive in 1,000 more. Each fork in time was a battlefield of its own, defended by Zalvari agents that had become more than machines. They were conceptual predators, feeding on uncertainty, using paradox as camouflage. The first strike was poetic. They reversed the assassination of a senator who, in the original timeline, had delayed peace negotiations. With her alive, the Trinova Accord never collapsed. That one correction unraveled 17 Zalvari infiltration paths. The second edit was bloodier. A fleet that had been ambushed and erased in the past now knew the trap before it happened. They emerged from hyperspace ready. The battle was chaos, fought between versions of reality, each trying to overwrite the other. It was working. But Zalvari responded. They deployed event eaters, beings of living causality, capable of devouring changes as they were made. Kyle watched in horror as entire corrections dissolved mid-implementation, replaced by false flags that redirected fate down the same dark spiral. They were losing ground. And then the Terrans made their final move. They didn't fight the event eaters. They rewrote their birth. The resolute Midnight surged forward, deeper into the root of the event layer, deeper than any human mind had ever traveled. There, at the singular point where time curled inward like a nautilus shell, they planted a seed, a single paradox so perfect, so vast, it could not be corrected. They gave birth to an outcome where humanity had always been unknowable. Not just powerful, not just advanced, but inherently outside prediction. In that moment, the Zalvari algorithms broke. Their calculations failed. Their future models dissolved into static. They had lost the thread of inevitability. Kale screamed as the ship surged back through layered time, each corrected moment locking into place behind them like a chain of salvation. The present awaited, new, reborn, alien in its familiarity, and so they returned. To a galaxy no longer certain. The galaxy they returned to wasn't the one they had left. At first, the changes were subtle. Stars no longer followed familiar sequences of death and rebirth. Constellations had shifted, reflecting the quiet chaos of rewritten causality. Ancient transmission buoys, once long dead, now pulsed with data from civilizations that had never fallen. Entire empires that had once been smothered in their infancy now stood proud, etched into the night sky with vibrant energy signatures and rich, diverse cultures. It wasn't a new galaxy. It was a redeemed one, a mosaic of corrected threads stitched together with surgical precision. But there was a tension in the air, a silence beneath the static. Something was waiting. Kale stood on the bridge of the resolute Midnight, not entirely certain if he was still the same man who had volunteered for the mission. He remembered things he hadn't lived, dialogues that had never occurred, scars from battles fought in other timelines, the taste of air on worlds that no longer existed. He wasn't fractured, but fused, every version of himself merged into a complex whole. Ress stood beside him, gazing at the stellar maps they'd just recalibrated. She looked unchanged, but Kale could see it in her eyes. She remembered too. All of it. Every choice, every loss, every impossible trade-off. And then the silence broke. Across the galactic core, in the Althan spiral, once the seat of Zalvari influence, space itself peeled. It wasn't an explosion. It wasn't even movement in the traditional sense. It was the unraveling of assumption. Ships long thought destroyed reappeared, frozen, hollow, drifting backward through entropy. Moons turned inside out as their inner geology was replaced with reverse memory patterns. Time itself hiccuped. And from the center of this quantum rupture emerged it. The Zalvari Prime, what had once been merely a governing intelligence, now returned not as a structure or a ship, but as a principle. It manifested as a storm of contradiction, a fractal knot of history, probability, and intention. Entire fleets disintegrated in its presence, not from weapon fire, but from invalidation. They ceased to have ever existed. The Zalvari hadn't been defeated in the traditional sense. Their future had been rendered undefined. But now, with that unpredictability, they had evolved into something more dangerous, desperate. Kyle realized, at first, not with logic, but with intuition. They're trying to fix themselves, to write us out. The event layer had stabilized, but only barely. The Terrans paradox had anchored a new trajectory, but it wasn't absolute. If the Zalvari Prime could embed a counter-paradox, if it could seed one more dominant probability, it could overwrite the new foundation. It would be as though humanity had never defied the odds, never risen, never mattered. So the Terrans responded. But not with ships, not with firepower. They broadcasted. A single message beamed across subquantum bandwidth, encoded in emotional resonance rather than language. It wasn't words, it wasn't even thought, it was meaning, compressed into pulses of coherent intention, structured like a living waveform. Every species that had ever felt terror under the Zalvari rule felt it. Every civilization that had once doubted their right to exist knew it. Hope. Not a blind, naive hope, but one forged in fire and contradiction. A certainty born of choice. The Terrans weren't promising salvation, they were offering defiance. All across the galaxy, ancient artifacts activated. Long-forgotten technologies left dormant by species the Zalvari had long erased. Monuments sang. Code buried in genomes activated. Machines billions of years old aligned like a galactic nervous system. The entire galaxy responded, not as a collection of separate empires, but as a singular organism rediscovering its will to resist. It was a war not of weapons, but of narrative. The Zalvari tried to inject contradiction into the signal. Corruption vectors, semantic viruses, probability malware. But the Terran's waveform had no syntax to exploit. It wasn't structured like a machine. It was structured like belief. You couldn't corrupt it, you could only choose to accept it, or be erased by it. Kyle stood at the center of the alignment node, now fully integrated into the ship's cognitive lattice. He could see the Zalvari Prime bleeding logic into the fabric of possibility, trying to suffocate the newborn future with its entropy. And then he made the final choice. "I believe," he whispered, not to the ship, not to the crew, but to the galaxy itself. It answered. The stars didn't flare, the ships didn't fire. Instead, reality pivoted. The Zalvari Prime fractured, not by force, but by isolation. Cut off from the newly accepted timeline, it became an orphaned logic tree, stranded in a future that no longer existed, and like all unsustained structures it collapsed. The rupture sealed, and silence returned. But this time, it was peace. Weeks passed, then months. Across the galaxy, the Terrans did not stay to rule. They did not ask for tribute. They left behind knowledge, tools, and the quiet understanding that freedom must be maintained, not granted. Kale and his crew returned to their time, forever changed. The galaxy they once knew now teemed with potential, not certainty, but opportunity. A future not written in stone, but in choice. Ress left the resolute midnight, her mission complete. She walked into the starlight of a world that had once burned, now reborn. She turned only once to look back, a soft smile tracing her lips. And Kale? He remained aboard the ship. Not because he had nowhere to go, but because he understood something profound. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. Not as long as someone, somewhere, believed. So the resolute midnight continued its journey across stars and systems, through the edges of known space. Watching, listening, preparing. Because somewhere out there, another silence was beginning. And this time, the galaxy wouldn't face it alone. If this journey through time, fate, and defiance lit a spark in your imagination, like, share, and drop a comment below. What would you do if you could rewrite the future? What truth would you preserve? This galaxy still has many stories left, and they might just begin with you.